Good morning, friends. We are still discussing the 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the chapter that is actually on death and liberation, how we can attain liberation at the time of death. Pretty much the entire chapter, as we have been seeing, I don't know how many verses we have seen so far, maybe 2 or 3 episodes on this chapter, they all start from this one question that Arjuna poses to Krishna, which is the second verse of the 8th chapter, where Arjuna asks, at the time of death, how can I achieve liberation? How can one achieve liberation when they leave the body? And Krishna gives a lot of different answers to that question, approaching it from many different points of views. And today I'm going to discuss with you verses 24 and 25 of the 8th chapter. So as always, I'm going to first read the verse. So here's how the verse itself goes in Sanskrit. Agnir Jyotiraha Shuklaha Shanmasa Uttarayanam Tatra Prayata Gachanti Brahma Brahma Vidojanaha. And this is the 25th verse. Dhumro Rasti Tata Krishnaha Shanmasa Dakshinayanam Tatra Chandra Masam Jyotirogi Prapya Nivartate. And now I will read. The English translation is written by Swami Kriyananda for these verses. Fire, light, daytime, the bright half of the lunar month, the 6 months of the northern course of the sun, pursuing this at the time of death, the knowers of Brahman go to Brahma. And this is the 25th verse. Smoke, nighttime, the dark half of the lunar month, the 6 months of the southern course of the sun, following this path at the time of death, one attains the lunar light and so returns to the earth. I don't know how much of those verses make any sense to you. I'll start by reading the first line of Swami Kriyananda's commentary, which made me chuckle when I read this a few days ago. Stanzas 24 and 25 of the 8th chapter are among the most abstruse and esoteric in the whole of Bhagavad Gita, if that's any comfort to you after reading that verse. So I'm not sure how much I can help today. I'll try my best and I'll share some of Yoganandaji's explanations on these verses and this beautiful commentary of Swami Kriyananda. This verse, these 2 verses of the Bhagavad Gita, they remind me of an episode in the Mahabharata. Not just remind me, they're actually lived out in the life of Bhishma, who's a character in the story of the Mahabharata. So I want to start there. I want to share that story. Oftentimes, I'll also say before getting into that, the way this verse is translated in a literal fashion by many commentaries of the Gita is how the southern and the northern course of the sun refers to actual movement of the sun in the sky. Now, I know the earth moves, sun doesn't move, but that's how it appears to us as we look at it from the earth. And so the northern course of the sun refers to that period of the year when sun enters the sign of Capricorn, which happens right now. That's why I thought I couldn't miss this opportunity to discuss this verse with all of you, because we are just entering the northern course of the sun. So it refers to the 6 months of the year, the bright half from the winter solstice going up to the solar solstice. The winter solstice is astronomically determined as December 21st, but sun enters Capricorn only on January 14th. So anyway, I'm not going to get into the details of all of that. There's a lot of differing opinions on how the equinox is calculated and the axis of the earth and how that moves and all of that. It's not as relevant to our discussion today. And the southern course of the sun is that time when sun enters a sign of Cancer during the month of July. And those 6 months, starting from the summer solstice to the winter solstice, where the sun is on the waning path, where the days are getting shorter, that is the southern course of the sun. So oftentimes, literal commentaries on these verses talk about how one attains liberation or one attains some sort of spiritual greatness if they leave the body during the northern course, which is between the months of January and July, and vice versa, which is one might attain a different state if they were to leave that body between the months of July and January. Of course, even just by common sense, that doesn't seem to add up all that much. And it's hard to imagine that's what Krishna was telling Arjuna. And guess what? He was not, as Yoganandaji explains to all of us. But there's an important story in the Mahabharata which actually makes it confusing, but unless we understand it from the right thread. And that is why some of these literal commentaries have stayed on with us for all these years. And this is the story of Bhishma. Now, as most of you know who have been following this series or who are familiar with the teachings of Yogananda ji, the entire story of Mahabharata is deeply symbolic. There's, of course, a literal story happening with a lot of characters. There's an actual war happening on a battlefield. But also, each one of these characters are symbolic of mental citizens, of aspects of our own consciousness. And that's what is useful for us in our own spiritual life as we understand the deeper meaning and the teachings that this scripture presents. And I've discussed some of this earlier in this particular series, and I also have a whole other series on YouTube where I retell the story of the Mahabharata in light of this symbolism of how the story unfolds and what each character represents. Now, I'm going to just focus on one very small piece of the story, which is this character Bhishma. Bhishma is often referred to as the grandsire. He is the grandfather of the two warring clans of cousins, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. If you don't have any context in all of this, just a 30-second summary would be just this, that the Pandavas and Kauravas are cousins, and the Pandavas represent the good guys, and the Kauravas the bad guys, and they're fighting for control of the kingdom. And in our own self, they represent upward and downward flows of energies. And Bhishma is kind of their grandfather, not actually their grandfather in terms of the blood relation, but he plays that role in the story. Again, all of these are deeply symbolic. And what Bhishma represents in the story, he is the symbol for ego, ahankara, that aspect of ourselves that thinks of this body, this mind as separate from everything else that there is. And Bhishma is symbolic of this aspect of consciousness within us. And interestingly, Bhishma is not a good guy, not a bad guy. He's somehow both at the same time. And it is very confusing in the story of the Mahabharata. And when we tune into the teachings of self-realization, and as Yogananda ji brought it, we understand that ego does play that subtle role. Ego is what keeps us separate. Ego is this fundamental delusion that keeps us going around and around in these cycles of reincarnation. But also, ego holds that seed desire to liberate us. It is only because of the desire of the ego that you're somehow interested this morning at 8:15 to even listen to this talk, or it is why we want to meditate, it is why we want to spiritually grow. So these are not coming from outside of the ego. So Bhishma plays this dual role. He's both our friend and our foe. Now, coming to the story, in this final battle, skipping to the actual core of where all this is happening, Bhishma takes the side of the Kauravas, the bad guys, because ultimately ego has to be killed. Ego has to be transcended in order for us to achieve final liberation, which is what Krishna is describing in the Gita. So Bhishma is fighting on the side of the Kauravas, but it's hard to say who he wants to win in the battlefield. He actually wants the Pandavas to win, but he puts up a very, very hard fight. He's not going to give up, and he's impossible to defeat. And the war goes on. For the first 8 days of the battle, the Pandavas are really trying to make even a little bit of progress. After 8 days of fighting tirelessly in this battlefield of Kurukshetra, they realize that they almost can make no progress until Bhishma is taken down. Because Bhishma is the commander-in-chief of the Kaurava army. The battle itself goes on for 18 days. And for these first 8 days, he fights so hard. Even the very first, I don't remember which episode or which verse, I discuss how Bhishma's conch represents the breath itself, and how he's constantly proclaiming the identity with the body when we are trying to pull the energy deep into that spine, deep into Sushumna. And Bhishma is putting up a very strong fight, and Pandavas are not able to make any progress in this battlefield of Kurukshetra. And on the 9th day, something very interesting happens. Arjuna decides that he has to face Bhishma head on. Arjuna, in this context, he represents the the power of the third chakra, the uplifting quality of the third chakra. And what it is that desire and the will to uplift, that determination, that willpower that we have to progress spiritually. And he is being guided by Krishna as the charioteer. That's the whole conversation that we are reviewing right now. And Krishna represents the intuitive guidance that is within. He represents the consciousness of the Guru. And what happens on the 9th day of the battle is both Arjuna and Krishna talk, and Krishna tells Arjuna, there's no progress in this war. There's no way to move forward until you can take down Bhishma. And Arjuna and Bhishma have this day-long fight. And Arjuna makes a lot of progress, but somehow, his knees become weak. Even after listening to the entire Bhagavad Gita, because the war is happening after Bhagavad Gita has already been shared, he's somehow not able to take Bhishma down. He makes a lot of progress, and Bhishma is also putting up a strong fight. And Bhishma is very close to giving up. If only Arjuna would be a little more aggressive. If only Arjuna would take a stronger stance. Bhishma is not unwilling to give up, but Arjuna is not able to do that. Arjuna somehow is not able to make that final push to take Bhishma down. And at one point, Krishna actually gets down from the chariot, and he takes down the fallen wheel of another chariot that is lying besides them. And he takes that wheel and he goes close to Bhishma just to kill him, because Krishna tells Arjuna, I'm completely frustrated. I want you to do this. I want you to just take Bhishma down. There's no other way forward here unless you can take him down. And Arjuna still is not able to do it, but Krishna moves forward. And when Krishna approaches Bhishma, this is a beautiful episode in the Mahabharata where Bhishma just understands who Krishna is. Bhishma understands that this is divine incarnate in flesh that has come to take him, that is offering refuge to this ego. So Bhishma completely drops his bow and arrow and falls down at Krishna's feet and says, this would be the honor of my life if you would just kill me right now. And then at the same time, Arjuna falls down and he comes to Krishna and says, Lord, please do not do that. You have taken this vow that I have to win this battle, so let me do this. I really appreciate what you're doing, but I'm going to do my best. You have taken a vow that you will not participate or take on any weapon in this battle, and I want you to hold on to that vow. So that's how that story ends on the 9th day of the battle. But Krishna knows even on the 10th day, as much as Arjuna wants to, he will not be able to take down Bhishma because it is not an easy task for Arjuna. So he recruits another person, and this person, his name is Shikhandi. And Shikhandi is described as a eunuch. He is, I guess in modern terms, you could call him a transgender person. I don't know what else he was. He was neither male nor female. He was somewhere in between. He was gender fluid. And in his own past incarnation, I won't go into that entire story, he was a woman by name Amba who has some unfinished business with Bhishma and who had taken a vow to actually kill Bhishma. And Shikhandi is an interesting character. Now what Krishna does is he brings Shikhandi also in the chariot along with Arjuna. So in Arjuna's chariot now there's not only Arjuna and Krishna but also Shikhandi hiding. Nobody knows that Shikhandi is in that chariot. And the plan is that Shikhandi is going to attack Bhishma because Shikhandi has no qualms. The only purpose of Shikhandi's life is to kill Bhishma. All that Shikhandi carries in his heart is absolute anger for Bhishma. And this is because of some past life business that Shikhandi and Bhishma had. I'm not going to that story. What Shikhandi actually represents symbolically within us is actually very similar to Arjuna, that force to uplift, that willpower. But Shikhandi is brute. Shikhandi is brash, whereas Arjuna is more the uplifted, calm quality of using that willpower in meditation. And Shikhandi is an interesting character because sometimes in the story of the Mahabharata, in the battlefield, we have to use that brash willpower in order to conquer some of the downward pulling tendencies within us. And that is the only way to ultimately conquer ego, because that final push takes more than just that calm quality of gradually navigating that battle. And what happens on the 10th day of battle is as soon as the chariots are pitted against each other, as soon as Krishna is able to take Arjuna's chariot in front of Bhishma, He immediately tells Shikhandi, now you can come up. Arjuna, you can step down now. And Shikhandi shows up, and Bhishma is shocked because he here thought that Arjuna was the one who was going to fight him, but it turns out to be Shikhandi. And when he sees Shikhandi, he realizes that this was the same woman who took the vow to kill him in her last life. And he sees her as a woman, and he immediately drops his bow and arrow because his dharma tells him that he shouldn't fight a woman in the battlefield. And so Shikhandi is able to take on Bhishma. And Shikhandi starts attacking Bhishma, and Bhishma puts down his weapons, and she starts shooting Bhishma's body with arrows. And at this point, Krishna calls upon Arjuna to finish the business. So Arjuna is now also able to attack Bhishma, who's given up completely. And his body is pierced with so many arrows that he actually does not die but falls down. And his body does not even touch the ground because all these arrows piercing his body hold his body on this bed of arrows. That's how the story is told. Now, how is all of this relevant to this verse? I'm coming to that point. I got a little sidetracked with all the details of the story. But Bhishma does not die at that time. Bhishma does not give up his life because of another story that I'm not going to get into right now. In the past, there was this boon that Bhishma received from his father, which is that he will only leave his body at his own will. Again, that is deeply symbolic because the ego can only relinquish control by itself. It cannot be forcefully dissociated from the body and the mind. So that's what Bhishma represents. And this blessing, this boon that Bhishma has is quite symbolic of that aspect of the ego itself. Now, Bhishma just lays there, and he's quite happy that he was taken down because, as I said, he wants spiritual liberation. Ego wants ultimate transcendence of all limitation. And he lays there and watches the rest of the war. And as we all know, if you don't know, the war ultimately goes in favor of the Pandavas, and all the Kauravas brothers die in the battlefield. And ultimately, the Pandavas win, and Bhishma is still lying there. And the way Mahabharata is told, this happens somewhere let's say in the season of fall. Bhishma does not leave his body because he's still in the southern course of the sun. This is where I'm coming to with this verse and this story. Bhishma waits until sun moves to its northern course. He lays there, as Vyasa describes, for 58 days. He, for the 8 days of the battle is over. After the 18th day of the battle, he is still there. And he does not leave the body, and he waits for 50 more days, lying on those bed of arrows in the battlefield of Kurukshetra until the time is right in order to finally take his last breath and leave that body. And right after the battle is over, in fact, all the Pandavas seek his blessing before Yudhishthira ascends the throne, and he imparts some very high teachings at that time as well. Now, this period, Dakshinayana and Uttarayana, that's what they're described as in Sanskrit. Dakshinayana is the southern course of the sun, and Uttarayana is the northern course of the sun. Bhishma, the ego, can free itself, can liberate itself only if it finds that right opportune moment to leave the body during Uttarayana. That is why Bhishma had to wait. Now, what does all of this mean? I said the literal story confuses the meaning of the verse because the story of Bhishma is even taken as further proof that the 6 months of the year are better than the other 6 months of the year for one to leave the body. But as Swamiji is describing here, the verse is rather abstruse and esoteric. I've already spent 25 minutes of the episode talking about Bhishma. I want to briefly talk about the literal meaning and what the southern and northern course actually mean. What Krishna is talking about here, fire, light, daytime. The fire is the fire of Kundalini. It is the fire of prana that is wound up at the base of the spine, and the light is the light of the spiritual eye. The light we are talking about is the sun within. At this point, and the bright half of the lunar month and the 6 months of northern course of the sun. What are we talking about here? It's rather abstruse, as Swami Kriyananda describes. Of course, there's the physical sun and the earth, and 1 full year is the revolution of the sun around, the revolution of the earth once around the sun in its orbit, and that's what creates the different seasons and the course of 1 year or 12 months as the earth proceeds in that fashion. And in our own self, on the astral level, on the energy plane, the sun is here, the spiritual eye, and the prana is flowing through the nadis of Ida and Pingala. So this coursing of energy in our astral spine can be considered as the movement of that earth or that individual reality around the sun, which is that anchor point through around which energy is circulating. And there are six chakras that are involved here. The seventh chakra does not come into play when we are talking about this orbit still. And the energy is flowing upward through the six chakras and downward through the six chakras. And there's a lot of symbolism here which I'm not going to discuss in this episode, but there are other episodes in my Kriya Yoga series where I discuss this in greater detail, where the chakras themselves represent planets and zodiac signs. And so the course that we are describing, that Cancer to Capricorn and Capricorn to Cancer again, the zodiac signs actually represents the upward and the downward flows of prana in our own spine. And as energy is going up and down, we are circulating it through these 12 zodiacs. We are circulating it unconsciously through every breath in our life. And when we practice a deep meditation technique such as Kriya Yoga, this circulation becomes a lot more conscious. That is why in the autobiography of a yogi, Yoganandaji describes how one round of Kriya Yoga, one round of the breath of Kriya Yoga is equivalent to 1 year of right spiritual living, because in 1 year we pass through these 12 months of 12 zodiac signs and all the different seasons to return to that same point. And when we practice Kriya Yoga, we are again circulating energy through those 12 zodiac signs, through the 6 chakras in our own astral spine, and we return to that same point in the sun. And what we are describing or reviewing in this verse is this aspect of the upward flow of energy itself. Because again, I've described this in previous episodes where I talk about conscious and unconscious dying and what all of it means. Because what downward flow of energy means when we leave the body is that during that final exhalation, if we are not spiritually conscious enough, if we are not dissociated with our body already through the practice of meditation by conscious detachment, what happens is that prana is involuntarily drawn out of the body. During the last exhalation, when the breath flows out, chakra by chakra, starting from the root, prana leaves its association with that physical body one by one, and it is drawn out through the medulla. And that is the southern course of the sun. And the northern course of the sun is when we leave the body in a conscious way. That same prana is leaving those same 6 chakras, but we are pulling it out. There is a sense of conscious detachment from those chakras. And when we are able to do that, we are able to pull that energy through the bright light of the day, as Krishna is describing. And that is through the sun, through the spiritual eye. We are able to exit the body consciously through that point, as Krishna describes in the 25th verse: smoke nighttime, the dark half of the lunar month, the 6 months of the southern course of the sun. Smoke nighttime, smoke obscures light. That's what smoke is. And nighttime darkness is the absence of light, or rather the shadow of light. So all of this, we are still caught in the delusion, in that identification with that material plane, and the deeper and stronger identification with our own ego. And when we leave that body in that state, energy is drawn involuntarily. We don't actually choose. It's almost naive to think that I'll just wait until January 15th to leave my body, because this is not a choice that we make on that simple level. This is a choice that we make over incarnations of consciously developing control of our own energies, and for being able to detach from our senses, from our body, to be able to draw that energy back into Sushumna. Because in order to leave through that northern course of the sun, in order to consciously draw energy through those 6 chakras and through the spiritual eye, one has to draw that energy into Sushumna. If the energy is still caught in that realm of Ida and Pingala, in that physical breath, in the realm of duality, when we leave the body, the energy has to be drawn involuntarily. God has to pull that energy out and detach us from the body against our own will for our own good, so that we can get another chance to try to start all over, and to try again to create that transcendence from that ego limitation. So, when we talk about the lunar light and the solar light, we are talking about the light of the ego, because that individuality, we have to understand, is also an element of God. Bhishma can never be killed in the battlefield because he has been given this divine boon that that aspect of our consciousness, that ahankara, that ego, is bestowed with this divine grace that it will never be killed. So Bhishma has the choice. Bhishma has this power. That will that he has is given to him from the divine. So there is light, that is the lunar light, but it is the limiting light of the ego. It is not the solar light. It is not the all-transcending divine light that will actually take us to liberation. So when we are leaving that body in that lunar light, it is not that we go to hell, as Krishna describes. What happens? I mean, we might suffer the consequences of our state of consciousness, not to say that everybody will be happy all the time, but it's not that we are doomed into some kind of disgrace. We can fall down if our consciousness is being drawn down by our own habit patterns and the karma that we have created. But what that means is we are returned back. We are returned back onto this material plane, hopefully in a human body, but as Swami Kriyananda describes in this commentary, we can go spiraling down even further into bodies of animals or into lower states of consciousness. And that is the lunar light of the ego. It will refresh and renew us back onto the material plane. It will continue that cycle of reincarnation. It is not going to push us into an eternal doom, but it cannot liberate us. What can liberate us is that solar light, is the light of the inner sun, which if we are able to draw ourselves into at the time of death, then we can have final liberation. So I'll see you all next week with another verse from the Gita. Until then, God bless you all.